Thank you so much, Phoebe, for that wonderful introduction. Thanks also to Ariane, Anna, and Candice not here today for organizing the seminar and for inviting me. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, past, present, and emerging, and just remind you all that live and work in land that was never seeded. So today's talk is about climate change adaptation in atolls, and I have a case study from a particular atoll in Papua New Guinea. It's called Budibudi. So this is how I want to run the presentation today. I want to, first of all, give you a bit of a context of, what is Budibudi, where it is, who lives there. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about adaptation, but rather than listing the number of adaptive behaviors, practices, and institutions, I'm going to try to flesh this out when describing what life looks like in Budibudi as I go. So it's a little bit better integrated. It doesn't read like a catalog of adaptation practices. I'm not sure if this is going to work. We'll see. I'm going to sort of, after giving you all the details about this place, I'm going to try and come up with a framework to try and make sense of all of this. And this is a little bit like putting the cart before the horse. Normally in a paper, you have the conceptual lens of framework before, and then you have a case study. Well, this is not a paper, it's a presentation. So I think it might work better if I give you the elements first, and then we can all think maybe together about the conceptual lens. And then I'll have a conclusion. But before I start, I want to state the motivation for this paper. There's this common assumption that islands and islanders and atoll dwellers in particular are vulnerable to environmental change, and that this vulnerability is intrinsic to the environment, to the atoll environment. It's almost like it's built in, it's unavoidable. And ultimately, it's the reason for the imminent demise of atoll dwellers, or even worse, perhaps, it's a motivation for external intervention. So we have this almost this moral obligation to save people who live in atolls. I think it's quote by John Campbell and John Burnett sums up quite nicely the implications of looking at atolls not as vulnerable places, but more as places where we can learn things, because people obviously have been living here for a long time and they've probably done a really good job of adapting. I just wanted to point your attention towards that reference to scientism, because we're going to go back to that in the end. Now, the premise of this talk is also the fact that we know very little about adaptation and adaptation in atolls in particular, and maybe it's worth learning some from the people who actually are adapting in atolls. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a context, like I said before. I feel like because we're in a geography department, I need to show some maps. So this gives you a bit of an idea of where Budibudi is. It's in part of Oceania that is actually known as near Oceania, as opposed to remote Oceania, which would be more to the Eastern Pacific. And this red circle here is Budibudi, so it doesn't even show in the map. You can see it's almost equidistant between the capital of Papua New Guinea, which is where it belongs, Port Moresby, and the capital of the Solomon Islands, Honiara. This is a bit of a more sort of like in detail regional map. So Budibudi is about 200 nautical miles distant from the capital of the province, Alotau. That's around 370 kilometers. So that's not only far, but it's also hard to get to. There's open seas. It's particularly rough during the easterly trade wind season. There are no visual cues for navigation, and this is especially the case as you travel back from, say, the capital to Budibudi, because it's a low-lying atoll. It's very easy to miss it. And in fact, people do miss it sometimes and end up in Bougainville or in the Solomon Islands, if they're lucky. But most importantly, there are no boat services. So if you have a dinghy with a 40 horsepower Yamaha outboard motor and 2 drums of fuel, you can try your luck, make it there. Otherwise, you have to wait for charter boats servicing the stores in neighboring Muyu, which is Woodlock Island, which is the island the closest to Budibudi. So Budibudi does have frequent exchanges with Woodlock, and that is also part of the adaptive strategy. We'll see that later. I'm going to give some facts about the Milne Bay province, which is a province where Budibudi is. It's a heavily populated province. There's in fact some islands that have a serious problem with the overpopulation. They're very high birth rates. It's clearly a maritime region with many transportation problems, as I was saying before. The islands are hard to reach. There's a low to null government presence in most of the islands. It's very difficult to get services to outer islands. It's also a very biodiverse region. This is the so-called Coral Triangle, which is also known as the Amazon of the sea because of this diversity. So lots of reefs, lots of islands, lots of fauna. And it's also very culturally diverse. There are 65 languages spoken in this area. And despite this diversity in terms of languages, it's more or less homogeneous in terms of the cultures. So most of the communities here are matrilineal. People are mostly subsistence horticulturalists and fishermen. They have very similar cosmologies, and they have very well-established exchange networks, of which perhaps the most famous is Akula, but not only. Okay, so this is what Budibudi looks like. This is a satellite image. There are 9 islands and 2 main settlements, the main village of Budelun or Unavek, and the other village, which is Oburak. And I'm going to give you like a very sort of like quick rundown of how the people in Budibudi see themselves in terms of where they come from, where the island comes from. So imagine that this, in ancient times, at some point was just like an interrupted piece of land. And this creator, this demiurge figure called Guerrero was sitting in Wasim, which is the island at the lower left corner there. And he was building a mountain because he wanted to plant some yams in this mountain. The locals got a little bit upset with that. They didn't like that. So they started chasing him away. So he got in his canoe, he started paddling away. And as they were chasing him up and catching up with him, he grabbed his paddle and he tapped the land to slow them down. So he did this 8 times, creating the 9 islands that you see now. And when he got to the very end of the land in Risiros, he was about to paddle away. And there was a mother and her daughter, and he felt really sorry for them because they didn't have any food. This place was barren. So he put in his paddle to give to them a pig's tusk, a coconut, and a yam. But as he was trying to give this to the people, the yam fell in the water. So he was only able to give them the pig's tusk and the coconut, which means that Budibudi is cursed. It has no yams like the rest of the province does, but it does have plenty of coconuts and plenty of pigs. And this is also very important in terms of adaptation, as we will see. So this is what it looks like according to my own drawings. It's not a very good drawing, but this was done before I came to a geography department. So obviously I was not very good at mapping. It does look like one big continuous village, but it's actually very well delimited in terms of hamlets by landmarks, as you can see here. To give you some demographics, this is based on a project that I did in 2015. At the time, there were 289 people. Some Budibudians were temporarily living in a settlement called Wanikera, which is part of Woodlock Island, which is this island that lies 75 kilometers to the west. There's a lot of back and forth between Budibudi and Wanikera. In fact, Wanikera has become a bigger settlement than Budibudi. At the time, I counted 20 seagoing sailing canoes, which is quite important. There were 7 dinghies, but only 3 had outboard motors, and there were over 240 domesticated pigs. As you can see, each plot of land belongs to a matriarch clan, and this is also important because you can't just live anywhere. So what are the problems related to climate change in Budibudi? Mostly sea level rise and coastal erosion. As you can see from these photos, it's pretty evident. In some places, it's in fact very acute. There are also some problems with coral bleaching, problems with saltwater intrusion. So this is a photo of a mangrove area that was said to be much thicker in the past. And as you can see from the photo, is pretty much barren. There are also periodic droughts. But the main problem, according to the people there, remains erosion. In fact, has taken away an old graveyard. There used to be where these fallen coconuts are. It has just taken away the graveyard. It has forced some people as well to move their houses. So this move can actually be seen in this satellite image. So what you can see here on the beach is the main settlement. Or the main village of Unovec. And as you can see, there's some villages, some households rather, some hamlets that have left the main village of Unovec and they've moved forward inland, further inland to these land plots that actually do belong to the matrilineages as well. So this is already, something that can be considered as an adaptive practice. People used to live inland, in fact. It isn't clear whether it was everybody all the time or if it was only some people sometimes, but there are definitely traces of old inland villages, both material, such as fruit trees in the bush, and immaterial ones that are mostly found in old stories and myths. It is true also that it was a normal colonial practice to move settlements from the bush into the coastal areas. This is mostly because it was a way to better control people during colonial times. But it's true that living inland and away from the sea allows people to avoid the damages of periodic king tides and flooding. And this is the reason why some people are actually moving back inland. Now, more recent adaptation measures that have to do with this sort of like intrusion of the sea, this periodic intrusion of the sea into the land, have to do with building houses on higher stilts. And how do we know this is an adaptation strategy? Because this was not always the case. So the photo on the left was taken at the turn of the century by Seligman during the major Cook-Daniels expedition. As you can see, the houses were not raised on stilts before. So this is very likely, or at least, as it was explained to me, the direct result of sea level rise. So how do people live in Budibudi? Clearly, I don't have time to list all the activities, but this calendar here should give you a very good glimpse of some of the main activities. This is a snapshot of a traditional calendar of 2 months, June and July, that is said to be particularly bad. In fact, one of them is that it's called the worst month. This is because of the winds, the lack of food. So people follow traditional calendars. It tells people when to plant what, when to harvest what, when to go fishing, where and what for. And clearly, many of these activities don't need a calendar. People live there, they know what to do and when to do it. So for instance, when the sea is choppy on one side because the predominant winds are blowing from that side, it's always easier to go fishing on the leeward side. So this goes without saying. But what happens is that climate change does throw some of these things off balance, and people have to adapt to these. So some of the signs clearly stay the same, right? Like the stars and constellations rise at these determined moments, and that doesn't change because of climate change. But these are very useful indicators of how things should be, and basically serves a purpose to gauge deviations. It allows people to understand how much things are changing, where and when things are changing. So calendars are not useful for something you give to the anthropologists to tell them this is what we do. They actually are a very good registry of how things ought to be and what are the deviations that are taking place from that. So what do people eat? Budibudi has some fenced gardens in the main island of Budelun. The soil, like in all atolls, is not great. It only allows for some crops. I counted 7 crops when I was there: sweet potatoes, papaya, pumpkin, corn, ibica, which is green, and tobacco, which I was told by Elisa it does count as a crop. It's very important, obviously, to have tobacco to smoke when you have basically nothing else there. As you can see, the fences, because as I said before, there are plenty of pigs in the main island. Now, these may seem like a relative abundance of and variety of crops, but to put the Budibudi gardens in context, you need to look at you need to compare this with other islands in the province. So this is a garden in the Trobriand Islands, which is to the west of Budibudi. It's a bigger island. So note not only the size, which is much bigger, but also how it's carefully arranged, carefully tended to, and weeded. Aesthetically is much more different. And obviously, it's also more productive. The gardens in the province, they yield plentiful yams, which is a staple crop of the Trobriand Islands and Woodlakan and many other islands. Yams are used as a currency in ceremonial exchanges and in other rituals such as marriages, funerals, or payments for services. And this is mostly because of their long shelf life. So yams do keep for a long time, for months. And in fact, they're stored in these very big decorated yam houses in the Trobriand Islands. But remember that Budibudi has no yams because of the curse of Guerrero. So they have to do with other things. They have smaller surfaces and poor soils. So in addition to the garden crops that I showed you before, they have 3 different types of crops that are grown outside of the gardens in other islands. of the atolls. So for instance, these are bananas that are grown in Risidos Island. They also grow taros and giant taros. So each island is basically dedicated to a crop. This is Wasim instead, which is the island here, the lower corner. This is the dedicated island for growing taros and giant taros because it has a swampy soil, which is obviously better for taros. But Wasim is also more exposed to sea spray. So people build these barriers of coconut fronds to shelter the taros. Now, what happens is that because Wasim is not inhabited, although it used to be inhabited in the past, there are plenty of coconut crabs and birds that could potentially ruin the taros. So what people are doing is they take plastic bottles that they that wash up on the beaches and they just put them on the taros that are growing to protect them from birds and crabs. Now, what's interesting is that locally grown taro is actually not a staple in Budibudi. It's a prestige food to be eaten on special occasions like mortuary feasts, or else is actually fed to outsiders. What happens is like when hosts visit Budibudi, they feed them taros and yams. And the yams obviously are obtained through exchange from neighboring woodlock islands. So sometimes what happens is like you have woodlock islanders visiting Budibudi and they're fed their own food. Seems like a bit of a paradox, especially when food is scarce. This also happens with pigs. So pigs are only eaten, despite like being readily available in Budibudi, they're only eaten on special occasions. They cooked on ceremonial clay pots, like this one here that is being watched over by Dulcie. And the clay pots are also obtained from other islands by exchange. So they're a very important part of Budibudi life, pigs, not so much for the nutritional purposes, but because they allow for these exchange networks to stay operational and they can be readily tapped into in times of need. So think of these as a high degree of specialization, this high degree of specialization in exchange as a long-term type of adaptation. So obviously, because the lack of good soils, agroforestry in Budibudi is very important. It's, you know, this is also the case in other atolls, and Budibudi is no exception. There's lots of food beyond the gardens. The fruits, leaves, shoots, nuts. I photograph and name at least 22 different species. They're not planted, they're only managed. And the forest is also the place to go for people to get wood for fire, construction materials for everything from a house to a canoe, bush medicine that is used through plants and vines and flowers. So in 2015, when I was there, I spent 4 months there was a very bad drought. In fact, in 4 months I was there, it didn't rain a single time. But none of these trees actually seemed to be affected by the prolonged drought. And there were no indications that this environmental change, or the drought in particular, was posing a threat. There's plenty of food. So for instance, these so-called lave noon, people told me that the more you harvest it, the more bountiful it becomes. I've never seen these before. I had never tried it. It's actually quite tasty. So there's some really weird stuff to be eaten there, but probably the cream of the crop, no pun intended, is this mangrove shoot. People eat mangrove shoots. I think the correct term is propagules. It's a fairly recent practice. So a man was credited with this innovation in the 80s. Nobody remembers where he got it from. So it's very likely that, you know, he got it from another part of Papua New Guinea because of all these exchanges. But it has now become a very established tradition, which really begs the question of what is really traditional knowledge and when does a new practice become traditional. But I think more importantly, it points to the irrelevance of categorizing knowledge as traditional. And I think what matters is having the necessary flexibility to incorporate foreign ideas into existing knowledge systems when you need to. So this innovation apparently happened during a particularly bad drought, and it was also a period of uncharacteristic windless months, which prevented people from traveling to neighboring islands. So they had to improvise, if you wish, and it worked quite well, so much so that this is actually part of their diet. But the main staple in Budibudi is coconuts. This is the real gardens, in particular this sprouting one that is known local as laben, which is eaten daily, 2-3 times a day. There are also ripe coconuts, which is a coconut that is in between the green one that you use for drinking and the sprouting one. But the ripe coconuts are actually mostly fed to pigs. twice daily. So the garden work, so to speak, is reduced to the minimum in Budibudi. And you start seeing that maybe this so-called curse is not so much so. What people do is they wake up, they climb for the green coconuts every morning. So they have green coconuts to drink. They also gather the ripe ones to feed to the pigs. And every 2-3 days, they go to Risiros Island and to other non-inhabited islands to get a stash of laben to eat in the house. As you can see, this boat full. If you're wondering what the sprouting coconuts look like, they're quite delicious and nutritious. Now, there are many norms around coconuts. So, for instance, it's socially acceptable to eat fallen coconuts, but it's not acceptable to drink the green coconuts that have fallen from the tree. And this is because you somehow have to earn your drink. You drink coconuts. People say that if you drink a green coconut that has fallen, it'll sap your energy, it'll make you lazy. There are all sorts of other like taboos that go with the coconuts. So this is all to say that the people of Budibudi have made it so that despite the distance with other islands and the lack of transportation, the lack of stores, the absence of good soils and the lack of productive gardens, food is not a problem in the atoll. In fact, so much so that people can afford feeding pets, like Agnes here, who's feeding her kingfisher pet that came to visit every day at dusk to get its share of fish, something that would actually horrify people in other islands. This would be seen as a waste of good food like fish. So people in the Trobriand Islands would be absolutely horrified to see that they're feeding fish to birds. And this abundance of fish hasn't really taken into account what comes from the sea yet. So obviously fish is plentiful in Budibudi like it is in most atolls. I collected over 200 names of fish when I was there. There are many different fishing techniques that depend on the targeted species, the season, the weather conditions. So people go spear fishing. There's a communal net fishing on tidal inlets. There's harpoon hunting at full moon of turtles and dolphins. There's Taiwanese fishing. There's trolling for pelagics during, like tuna, for instance, during the easterly trade winds. So there's no shortage of fish. Obviously, they alternate the fishing sites as well, depending on the seasons. Shark fishing was extremely important up until the 1960s, and Budibudi is the only other place in Papua New Guinea where this was the case. It was a highly ritualized practice. I don't have time to go into detail. There are at least 9 different types of sharks. So people nowadays still like eat shark, but they don't hunt it the way they used to do it. So after all this inventory of animal and botanical species and how Budibudi Islanders interact with them, I'd like to pause for a second and consider this alleged fragility and smallness of island environments as being limited systems with little or no diversity. I think this is something that's questionable, to say the least. Another recent practice, adaptive practice, is giant clam farming. This is a consequence of the depletion of giant clams in the 1980s by Taiwanese fishermen. And there's also an increase in the number of days in which fishing conditions are suboptimal. So farming for clams, which implies taking small clams and bring them close to the shore to establish a farm, helps with food security, but it also helps reseed local reefs with clam larvae. So it has a positive impact on the corals. And obviously nothing goes to waste, being a remote atoll. The giant clam shells are used as water and food troughs for pigs. Another important thing is that, whereas in other parts of the province, fishing and sailing is done exclusively by men, in Budibudi, women go fishing and diving regularly. This is very important because, for instance, single mothers can provide for their families without having to rely on male siblings. And they keep a degree of independence that is rarely seen elsewhere in the province. So women, for instance, dive for a bokiyao, which is this strawberry conch, Conomorix luhuanus, which is an abundant source of protein. It's very readily available, and it requires very little preparation. All you have to do is just put in the fire and eat it. So obviously, many of the fishing activities require canoes, but canoe making is essential to adaptation in atolls in other ways as well that are not just fishing. So obviously, they're the main means of transportation of people and things within the atoll. canoes in Papua New Guinea, this part of Papua New Guinea at least, are an outstanding piece of technology that has seen little changes over the last century, mostly because it works. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this canoe technology. It requires a very specific type of conceptual knowledge to understand the design of the different elements of the canoe. It requires technical skills to make those elements and to put them together. And mind you, all these elements within the canoe are tied together. There's not one single nail. Everything is done with rope. But canoe making also demands active land management to make sure that all the species required to make a canoe are available in a small archipelago. So this is literally a piece of technology that guarantees your survival. You can't make a canoe here. You're pretty much screwed. So each item in the canoe is made with one type of tree species. There's typically more than one for each element in the canoe, and these are graded. So if you can't find A, then you use B. So when competing, when species have competing uses, you have to decide what do you give the preference to. So just to give you an example, the gaff, which I think is what that element in the canoe is called, is, you can make it with this type of mangrove, the red mangrove, or you can also make it with this other type of species. This is really interesting as well because some very large trees can have a big branch cut out to make a smaller fishing canoe without actually killing the tree, which allows you to conserve the tree where it is. And this is very important, especially in coastal areas, because of course it slows down erosion. Now, some tree species require more proactive management than others, and this is the case for these very important species called the calcedai. This is a tree that is used for the keel of the canoe, and according to some researchers, this tree played a key role in the Austronesian expansion into the Pacific and Madagascar. So what happens is that you have juvenile specimens that are of the right characteristics that start being watched by the owners of the land plot where the tree is growing. And this takes place over years. So this tree is actually very much liked for its characteristics, one of which is the fact that it curves as it grows. But you have to make sure that the curve is right. So if it's too curved, it'll be really good in terms of tackling the waves, but it won't be a fast canoe. If it's not curved enough, it's the opposite. So yeah, it'll be fast, but it might succumb to the waves. So when the right tree is identified, the owner puts a taboo on it. It prevents anybody from cutting it until it has reached the right size, which can take 1 or even 2 generations. And the tree has also very sort of like important symbolic importance. The tree is said to be female, said to menstruate, must be cut following a right set of taboos. So they put like a grass skirt around it before cutting it. And what this does is it ensures a higher level of protection of the tree, so nobody would cut the tree just anyhow. And sometimes all this careful planning matters less because the ocean gives you the keel of a new canoe into the shape of flotsam. Like it's the case here with Primo, who's very happy. And obviously you don't have to drag it from the forest and take it to the beach and cut the branches. It's almost like ready to go. So you have this highly sophisticated canoe technology that allows you not only to exploit the sea for resources, but also establish these networks. So this is another very important aspect of adaptation in Guribori, is this kind of mobility. The larger canoes, this is a small one. So imagine a canoe that is twice the size of this one. They can take up to a dozen people and upwards of 500 kilograms of load. So the people of Budibudi have specialized in the manufacture of canoes, but also products for these exchanges that take place mostly or almost exclusively with Wulak Island. Most notably a type of sleeping mat that is sewn together from pandanus leaves that is known locally as sag, and it's traded in exchange for sago cakes. So sago is this substance that is made with the pith of a palm tree. It's fairly nutritious. The exchange rate has remained the same for about at least 100 years. So 2 sleeping mats equal 5 sago cakes. And the people of Budibudi have also developed a unique technique in the province to desiccate the sago so it keeps for months, so they can keep it for much longer than anybody else in the province. So Budibudi is not part of this exchange called the Kula that is probably very well known to anthropologists. I don't know how well known it's to geographers. I'll explain a little bit of this later. But basically, this is all based on this canoe technology, right? And you have, as you can see, this group of islands where people exchange through these ceremonial, they exchange shells. So the necklaces circulate clockwise. The arm shells circulate anti-clockwise. You always have a partner in another island. The shells are never yours to keep, and the only thing you get out of this is prestige. But you know, on the side of this exchange, you can also get other things. So remember the clay pots before, remember the pigs, remember the mats, remember all these other things. So even though Budibudi is not part of this exchange, because it does exchange periodically with woodrock, they do get all these things in the deal as well. Okay, so this is just to give you a bit of an example of how people start learning the navigation skills and how to make canoes and how canoes work. So this is a toy model canoe that kids start like playing with. And you know, what happens like as kids grow old, and this is both male and female kids, obviously, they start playing with canoe models, they understand the winds. And then they start playing with dugout canoes and they get the balance right, they start punting them, and then they get to a point quite early on where they actually manage to sail by themselves. But let's go back to these exchange networks and the manufacture of these sleeping bags. These also require the active management of the white pandanus species, which is done exclusively by women. Pandanus was obviously even more important in the past because the sails of the canoes were also made of pandanus. Nowadays they're made of canvas or plastic, but the sewing is also still done by women. So the ownership of pandanus plantations is transferred matrilineally. The pandanus leaves are harvested and processed, and when they're ready, they are sewn together using the aerial roots of the pandanus tree as well as thread. So this produces these very good sleeping mats that are very soft, they're very comfortable, they're easy to carry around, they're waterproof, and they're still highly valued all over the province. So let's talk a little bit about these sociocultural adaptive practices. I only have time to focus on a couple of these. Perhaps the most interesting one is this one called sipurureo, which is this practice that pregnant women and women who have just given birth do for at least 1 or 2 years after the child is born. So they drink twice a day, they drink salt water. Why do they do this? Well, when you ask people there, they say that this is done to help the mothers recover from the loss of blood. It also helps them to cleanse inside. Seawater is considered to be like a medicine. It's considered to be, give strength to new mothers. Obviously, this also has to do with the sort of like values and beliefs and the ontological consideration of salt water as a hot substance, and therefore something that is needed to keep the right balance of heat cold in the body. So women give birth right on the beach. If it's high tide, they'll even give birth in the ocean. The newborn babies are given warm coconut juice as a very first drink, even before they start breastfeeding, so that their bodies don't lose any warmth. And then mothers sleep on top of this platform under which is a constant fire burning for the same reason. The men also used to take, grown men used to take younger teenagers to a separate part of the island and make them fast and drink seawater for a week or two as part of an initiation ritual that, you know, was considered to make them stronger and more attractive. But as you can see, this is also a cultural practice that makes people more resilient. So obviously, they don't need to drink water. They don't care about drinking salt water. And it's not only that people in Budibudi seldom drink fresh water because they have abundant coconuts. This is, you know, it's more than availability. This is a social practice that establishes what needs to be drunk and when. Okay, so most of the practices and the institutions and so on that I've mentioned in this talk are actually represented visually in this hand-drawn map. It locates and names of fishing grounds, places where certain crops and trees grow, and occasions why they grow there by virtue of a legend or a myth, which reefs are exposed at low tide, and what resources can be harvested on those, or in which direction existing sandbanks extend when the currents change with the seasons. So this allows to plan ahead for things like where to put your giant clamshell farms so that the larvae are not taken away beyond the reef by the sea currents. But this is to show that the very sort of like specific individual adaptive behaviors that are grounded in the place. So this is, the place, so to speak, is represented, but it's also constructed physically and symbolically and socioculturally. The map is also a very good historical record of environmental changes. So for instance, people in Budibudi have two names for reefs. One name is for reefs that are exposed at low tide, except for that is no longer the case. Apparently the sea level has risen so much, according to people, that reefs that used to be exposed at low tide are no longer exposed. So a map like this allows you to keep track of this. Now, let's go back to the framework, to what conceptual lens can be used to make sense of all these different practices, what is better. So there be typically two conceptual lenses or two frameworks that be used in these situations. One is so-called ecosystem-based adaptation or nature-based solutions. And I'll read you a definition. It's defined as combining biodiversity and ecosystem services into an adaptation and development strategy that increases the resilience of ecosystems and communities to climate change through the conservation, restoration, and sustainable management of ecosystems. The other one would be traditional environmental knowledge or indigenous local knowledge. I'm not entirely happy with any of these frameworks. I think they're not entirely adequate. I think many of the behaviors, the practices, the norms and institutions that I have sort of like touched upon in this talk are intrinsically associated to a system of beliefs and values, or culture, if you wish, that go beyond a rational interpretation and exploitation of the ecosystem. And especially if you consider the ecosystem as a separate entity or an accumulation of traditional knowledge-based practices. So even though the way I've presented these does look like a catalog or an inventory of traditional environmental knowledge, I think that does not cover everything. I find that a little bit not fully satisfactory. But I think it's, what happens here, the adaptive practices cannot be envisaged individually, or you cannot disassociate them from the culture in which they exist. In fact, there's some people who have tried to use that as a framework to make sense of what happens in the province and for policy making. So this is an assessment of ecosystems, goods and services in the Middle Bay province that was done by Butler and other co-authors in 2014. They divided the province into 10 subregions, and Budibudi, as you can see there, is grouped together with Woodlark in the islands to the west. These ecosystem goods and services are affected by drivers of change. Some are natural and some are human induced. So the authors developed these management strategy importance indexes, and what you can see there are the ones for Woodlark and obviously Guribori as well. But you can see already that like very few of these actually matter for the people of Budibudi. The same goes for this model that they devised based on this: the driver, pressure, impact, state, response. And again, most of this does not apply to Budibudi. There's no pollution from gardens, there's no logging, there are no problems with overfishing. So this actually makes very little sense to this place. How about traditional environmental knowledge? Well, this is an approach that gathers systems of knowledge and puts them into databases to protect them against the loss, but also to analyze knowledge that can be applied elsewhere. But I also find it very problematic. First of all, it's a good example of ex situ conservation of indigenous knowledge. So projects often are initiated and financed by international development agencies outside of the place. This way, traditional environmental knowledge is often separated from its source and some of its elements, particularly those that are seen as unnecessary for development projects, such as rituals, words, actions, so on and so forth, are discarded. And then they're particularized, and the remainder is particularized and recast as scientific knowledge by validating it using Western scientific criteria. So basically, what you have is this particularization, this validation, this abstraction and generalization that equals to this scientization, as we saw in the introduction, which is pretty much like truth making, right? So I think what's more important is to see how the elements relate among themselves rather than just making like a list of separate elements. how to do this? Well, this is also a type of framework that perhaps is not entirely satisfactory, but I think it's a little bit better than the former one. It's this one developed by Eleanor Sterling and some other colleagues at the American Museum of Natural History, that basically looks for biocultural, ecocultural indicators in places. So this is assumption that climate change is a global natural phenomenon, with the stress in the natural, hence the importance of the ecosystems. But this vision actually ignores a little bit that the natural of the climate change is not so, that it's also not global for that reason. So every single phenomenon, disaster, or change in the environment is made sense of in the cultural terms specific to a place, into a group of people. So from that angle, there are different, sometimes even contrasting natures, and understanding them is essential if we are to successfully adapt, because it's not adaptation unless it's in the terms of the people who are actually seeking to adapt. In addition, the responses to climate change are beyond natural in the sense that we use social, economic, political, and cultural tools to adapt. So the question is about having choices. So what does a biocultural, ecocultural framework do in that sense for us to try to understand what adaptation looks like in places like Budibudi? Well, allegedly it does promote the co-creation of knowledge that is the result of the integration of place-based practice and Western science. It integrates local, national, and global indicators of success. These indicators are relevant locally, so at the sites of adaptation and planning for future changes needed, with the ultimate goal of maintaining or improving the well-being of that place. So how does it do that? Well, it starts with local cultural perspectives. So it starts with the values, the knowledge, and the needs of the place. It tries to identify feedbacks between ecosystems and human well-being. So you start with local knowledge, human practices, and cultural beliefs that influence and are influenced by the land and the seascapes of which human communities are part of. And it sort of like integrates all of these in situ and ex situ knowledge. So this is probably better understood with an example, again, from McCarter and Sterling. So this is an example that looks at water in Aotearoa in New Zealand. So again, it's not considered as a resource, as a resource, or in terms of its quality, but it's more understood as an external, which is an external indicator, but it's understood more in local terms. So in a more sort of like emic way from a Maori perspective. The same can be said about Budibudi in terms of food. So using external indicators, one might think that maybe food is not abundant there, or is insufficient, and there are problems with famine, but as we've seen before, that's hardly the case. So to conclude, why does this matter? I think instead of giving you a sort of like theoretical conclusion, I'm going to give you an example that is based again on my time there. So there was this drought that was very acute. It was actually causing a lot of problems in all the parts of Papua New Guinea as well. And the disaster office of Alotau sent aid to Budibudi, because in fact, the people of Budibudi are very exposed, like most atoll islanders. But because of this inherent adaptive capacity that we sort of like seen a little bit here, this exposure is actually not coupled with vulnerability. So this exposure does not equal to vulnerability. So what happens is that the disaster office sent drinking water to Budibudi. They sent all these jerry cans of drinking water. And within a couple of days, the containers had been emptied for the children to play with them and just make like these little canoes. So this is just to say that if we look at these external indicators of vulnerability, we don't get the full picture. And in fact, you can sort of like misconstruct aid and help, and even like make policies that are completely irrelevant to the people of the place. And I think I'll leave it here. Sorry, I went over my time. Thank you.
Hi. Sorry, I was thinking. Yeah, so I think, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And I think that we could open the floor for some questions. Anyone who wants to start with a question? Yeah.
Thanks, Sergio. That was really, really fascinating, visually very absorbing too. I guess I'm interested in hearing, thinking about the models and frameworks that you were discussing at the end, and I guess what you were preferencing were frameworks that try and incorporate kind of more of the elements and dynamics that you're presenting to us, and I kind of get that. But I guess to push back on that, I'm interested in hearing, I suppose, from a perspective of, I guess, the kind of epistemology politics of this. Are there things that can't be known? Are there things that you're not privy to? Are there secrets that are part of this whole thing? What are the things that remain confusing or disorienting for you in this? And what does that do to our understanding of adaptation?
Absolutely, that's a really good point. In fact, there's a lot of secret and sacred knowledge. People are not always willing to explain everything to you. From my sort of like perspective, I have to acknowledge my positionality. As a man, I cannot ask certain questions to women. So that part of knowledge is completely beyond my reach. It's also very problematic, even if you had access as a researcher to that type of knowledge, because as I was saying before, there's a lot of theory about what to do with traditional environmental knowledge databases. Who controls them, what for. Obviously, we have this sort of we commodify knowledge. We're in a university. This is what we do. We sell knowledge, so to speak. Why should the people of this place tell us, like these things for free? You can argue that is so that people in similar circumstances, in similar contexts, can learn from this. Sure, but a lot of this is actually done without, the mediation of researchers. Like I said, there's lots of exchanges that take place. The mangrove shoot thing is just an example. There's lots of exchanges in terms of species. People sometimes come up with a type of sweet potato that is more sort of like drought resistance, or a type of potato that grows better when it's exposed to sea spray. So these exchanges actually do happen, more organically, more naturally. That's why I think that it's like, for us, it's probably just enough to understand this without even maybe going too much into detail. But I think what like the takeaway lesson, if you want, is that atolls are not as vulnerable as we think they are, and we just need to pay a little bit more attention of about the things that people are doing there in terms of adapting, or the things that are perhaps adaptive in and of themselves that would that would prepare them to cope better with changes. Only that answers your question.
Thank you for this question. Hi, thanks, Sergio. That was a beautiful presentation. I'm just wondering about your language choices. And I don't know if I came late, sorry. So I don't know where these terms, traditional, ecological, or environmental knowledge and Indigenous local knowledge were coming from, but I kind of see them both as a trap. Why not just talk about Indigenous knowledge and recognize that kind of relationality and dynamism that is at the core of Indigenous knowledge, which is built through networks of exchange and continual outward-looking kind of growth to other places, kind of the in and the out. Like, what is the kind of fixation on the local here?
Totally, yeah, absolutely. In fact, Sterling and her colleagues talk about place-based knowledge because they acknowledge the fact that it's not all traditional, and again, the mangrove sort of innovation speaks volumes about that. And it's not only people who are from the place. I mean, these places, again, because of this constant churn, they have people coming from other places. So, maybe they're not locals in the strict sense of the term, but yeah, you're totally right. And that's my contention with these terms that I found all over the literature, as you know. I mean, it's not, I didn't come up with it. As an anthropologist, I always question, what is traditional, when does something become traditional? So this sort of newly incorporated thing that is fairly recent, from the 1980s, is that traditional? At the same time, people in Papua New Guinea are very, very Christian, so they have this very sort of syncretic worldview. So if you ask them, why are these changes happening, some people might tell you it's this is because of God wants it this way. So you have to deal with that as well. And again, that's, you know, like, I don't know to what extent you can say that this syncretism is traditional as a worldview. You could argue so because, you know, the place was missionized, you know, for over 100 years. But yeah, I mean, I don't think, you know, I don't think that tag, I think it's just that. I think it's precisely just that, the tag. I don't think it does a lot in terms of helping us understand, you know, what goes on there. Yeah.
There's a question in the Q&A. If you want to open it from there, maybe you want to follow it up to put it on.
Oh, okay.
I can read it for everyone. There. So it says, "Hi Sergio, it's very insightful presentation. I'd like to ask, what are the challenges to bring the ecocultural, biocultural lens of practices materials, and to what extent do you think state / non-state or more organized interventions are needed to make it applicable in other similar small island contexts, or do you see it's counterproductive to this approach?"
Yeah, it's a very good question. Thanks, Naima. What are the challenges? I would say, like, you know, the three usual ones: time, money, and the will to do it. So obviously, you know, you need to be able to spend enough time in a place like this to, you know, learn these things. And, you know, I spent 4 months, it's probably nowhere near enough. Then, you know, you need the will to sort of like, you know, listen to the people and develop together with the people as a collaboration, you know, like these indicators. And then obviously you need money, you know, you need money to sort of like apply whatever findings you have. So, you know, if the purpose is to guarantee the people's resilience, you know, through access to food security, it might be easier to actually, you know, send a ship with rice and flour than, you know, to wait for them to sort of like develop like more traditional exchange networks so they can provide for themselves. I don't know if that answers the question, but mine is not here, so.
There's another chat question from Simon. No, nothing. Sorry, I lost it. Oh, maybe you can do the. Sorry, I lost it. So can you just I can find it? It's in the chat.
Oh, it's in the chat. Okay.
Okay.
Remind you to get copies to the services.
Ah, all right. It's organized.
Has there originally been raiding and warfare, perhaps before the missionaries, and was this not adapted in Western terms, and that it was traumatic and disruptive? You can stop sharing. I know it's not here.
So,
you can still see it.
is it in more chat? Okay, right, got it. Okay, has it traditionally been raiding and warfare? Yes. And was this non-adaptive in Western terms? Yes. Yeah, there was such thing. Perhaps not so much in Budibudi because, as you've seen from those maps, it's quite out of the way. But yeah, there are many other islands in the province where yeah, there was like a lot of raiding. Is that adaptive or not? I don't know. I don't think I have an answer to that question. Sorry, Simon. But you know, I'm gonna say it's not adaptive when somebody is raiding you and killing you. Yeah, probably not that adaptive. One of these answers the question. Celia?
Yeah, it's a great presentation. So what I'm wondering is, I get that there's an impetus to look at ways that people cope and have resilience and diverse practices and enable them to deal with climate change. But I wonder, is there a risk in overstating their strength and ability? Because if people in this particular place are not vulnerable, then who is vulnerable? I mean, I think I'm not framing that question well, but you know what I'm
yeah,
saying.
I think we're trying to get at. Obviously, there is a risk of essentializing all of this. The way I'm presenting it to you is, you know, like, this is fantastic. Look at these people. You know, they've been here for ages. They fend for themselves. Partly because there's no government services, you know, they're left alone, so they have no choice. Yes, there's a risk. And obviously, if you ask people, you know, like, would you like to have, you know, stores here? Would you like to have a job? Absolutely. In fact, when I was there there was the Beach de Mer, the sea cucumber season was closed, but it has now reopened. So there was a very long moratorium in Papua New Guinea because stocks of sea cucumber were exhausted. Sea cucumber, for those of you who don't know it, is a very expensive product. I think it's a mollusk. It just lives in the bottom of the sea that you collect, you dry, and it's sold mostly in Eastern Asia markets. People make a lot of money for local, for local standards through these. And when they do make money, yeah, they do buy rice, they do buy things. So yeah, it's, I think it's a challenge to how to actually sort of like try and understand these and incorporate this into, like a practice of adaptation without essentializing. But I think the key lies in, the people themselves. So, like in seeing, like, how important are these practices to the people in those places, and what are the things that they're willing to trade off to maybe just get like other things, and the things they're not. Obviously, if you ask them, they'd like to get like better education, better transportation, better communications, and access to like healthcare. Yeah, it's again like I'm aware that I may have presented a very rosy picture. It is a beautiful place and people are very happy. And compared to other parts of Papua New Guinea at the time that were experiencing the drought, they were doing much, much better. But this is also, to say that, it's in the eye of the beholder. So there was, for instance, one woman who was from Budibudi, but she didn't grow up in Budibudi. She grew up in another island in the province called Misima, which is an island where there's a mine. And then she married there a man from Misima, and she went back to Budibudi. The way she lived was slightly different from other people. So for instance, she was a great gardener. She was very proud of her pumpkins because she had like these really big like pumpkins in her garden. And then the drought came in, and she would complain like, every Sunday after the church service, she'd complain to the rest of the community that her pumpkins were dying. Nobody really cared much about this because, sure, I mean, if you have pumpkin, you eat it. It's great, but we're not gonna starve to death if there's no pumpkins. So yeah, it's a little bit. It depends a little bit on your position. So for her, the drought was a problem. For other people in Budibudi, this drought was just business as usual. It was no problem whatsoever. Sorry.
It's all right. I think you mentioned it. I was going to ask about marriage, and you mentioned something, so you can go on.
Yeah, I was going to ask. So, in like technology, the resilience of this community, there's thinking about vulnerability, looking forward, how are there risks to a lot of things like this?
Yes, I think it might get to a point, might get to a tipping point where, it's no longer possible to carry on with many of these practices. I think I need to spend more time there to assess if that would be the case and when. But like I said, so far so good. People have memories and recollections of really bad droughts in the past, and they cope with those without major upsides to their livelihoods. Of course, sea level rise is a different thing. It's coastal erosion is forcing people to move elsewhere. And again, this is an atoll. There's not a lot of room to move to. So if the incidence of king tides was, beyond a certain number a year, yeah, it might kill the coconut trees, of course.
We're over time.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Sergio, again.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.